Hello, everybody. Welcome to Vietnam 360 on the Library Channel. We appreciate you being here today. If you haven't seen our show before, our goal is to talk to Vietnam veterans and other people whose lives were affected by the Vietnam War and have a chance for those people to tell their stories and get them on the record, so to speak. We're really particularly glad to have our guest today. It's Hickman Ewing, who is known to a lot of people in Memphis and Shelby County in the Mid-South as a federal prosecutor. He's no longer a federal prosecutor. He's still dabbling in the law as a private attorney, but he is a Vietnam veteran. He is not only a Vietnam veteran, his two brothers are Vietnam veterans, and he has a very interesting stories to tell, and we really look forward to the next hour with him. Mr. Ewing, I really appreciate you being here. We were talking earlier about how we grew up. You and I are a few years apart, but how we grew up with fathers particularly who had served in World War II and how that set us on a course in our life. Would you talk about that, please?
Yes, I think growing up, I think the military was an honorable and noble pursuit. My father served in World War II in the Navy. I had an uncle that served in the Marines in the South Pacific. I had another uncle who got out of Whitehaven in 1943, got shot down over the South China Sea in late 44 and died. I grew up seeing his picture and his posthumous Purple Heart. Another uncle was in the Air Corps. So, you know, we grew up, my dad went to reserve meetings. You know, we always looked up to the military growing up and were taught, you know, the military serves at the pleasure of the president, and, you know, when he gives orders, you follow him. And so I learned about history, and I ended up majoring in history in college, and knew a lot about, you know, World War II, World War I, and so forth. So, when I got out of high school, I got a Navy scholarship to Vanderbilt, and that was 1960, knowing I would do 4 years college and 4 years Navy. My two brothers, who graduated in 1963, they immediately went in, one in the Army and one in the Marines. So we knew how the military operated and looked forward to serving.
So tell me about what happened after you graduated from college. You went into the Navy, and you had expected to do that from a time you were much younger, I assume.
Right. And so we, you know, every summer in college, we would go on 2 months active duty. And so I'd really been on 6 months active duty before I graduated, but I was assigned to a ship out of San Francisco. This is July of 1964. The month before, what would become known as the Tonkin Gulf incident happened, and we were called back to our ship. This was a refrigerated supply ship. When a carrier is out, they've got to have beans, bullets, and black oil to be able to stay out on station. So we went from San Francisco to Japan and then off Vietnam. So October of '64, I'm off the coast of Vietnam alongside the Constellation from where they're launching strikes on the north. So I was on that ship for 2 years in what we call the 7th Fleet.
And what did you do on that ship that you were on?
I ended up being the navigator. So I made 6 Pacific crossings using the stars. This is pre-satellite. This is pre-GPS. This is the way they used to do it when they had iron men and wooden ships, so to speak. So you would look at the stars, and there was a formula to get you across the ocean. And then, of course, when you're along the coast, you would use radar and other devices. So we were there, of course, to support the 7th Fleet, who was bombing the north. And in fact, the first pilot that was captured, Alvarez, flew off the Constellation, and we were within a month or so replenishing that ship. And I had a very good friend from high school that was killed in the fire on the Oriskany. He had already flown a number of missions over the north. And so we were in the fleet, but we followed what was going on the ground as things kept escalating.
So before this started, and Vietnam probably wasn't any better known to you than it is to anybody else in terms of what was going on over there.
No, I mean, was a history geography major, so I knew the capitals of all the countries in the world, but I didn't, we didn't really follow that.
Yeah.
I remember taking Far Eastern history in college, and we studied Japan and China. We didn't even look at Vietnam.
Yeah. Now, for our audience will notice, we've got a swift boat. We have a model which you brought along today of a swift boat, which is the boat that you served on next, or the type of boat. If we could just kind of back up for a second and tell me how you got to this kind of occupation.
Okay. Well, as Vietnam continued to escalate in the spring of 1965, the U.S. had suspected for a long time that the North Vietnamese were resupplying the South with ammunition and other things by sea. And they didn't have any hard fact, but finally there was a place called Vung Ro Bay, and they saw a trawler there unloading, and they called in airstrikes and found that indeed this was a trawler from North Vietnam with millions of rounds of ammunition. And so at that point, the powers that be in America, who are now on the side of the South Vietnamese, said we need to come up with a way to interdict these infiltration efforts. And so the South Vietnamese coast is 900 miles long, and so they established 9 zones. Each was about 100 miles long, and put a destroyer or some kind of ship like that in it just for surveillance. Then they decided we need smaller boats, and so they contracted with a company in Louisiana to buy, like, I think 90 boats, which they became swift boats. These had been used to take people out to the offshore oil rigs, and so they configured them and put weapons on them. And so that's the boats you see before you. These were called PCF, Patrol Craft Fast, better known as swift boats.
It's funny that the boats that were used to launch the invasion on D-Day were created by a man named Higgins, who was also from Louisiana. Was there any connection between those two?
No, I don't think there was. And then, so
just a coincidence.
Yeah. So I'm in the fleet, and at some point part of our duties, in addition to replenishing the carriers that were bombing, we would go along the coast and replenish the destroyers in the other areas. So went all the way around to the other side of Vietnam. And we got a message in saying that we now have these swift boats, and we're looking for volunteers. Lieutenant junior grade, which is the same as an Army first lieutenant, qualified officer of the deck on a big ship, to volunteer for a 1-year assignment. So I volunteered. And so I went to 3 months training in Coronado, San Diego. Went to survival school, which is the worst week of my life. Language school for 2 weeks. Weapons school, boat school. So, you were ready to go when you went over there. Part of the survival school, it was called Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, because already a bunch of people had been captured by the communists, and they were saying all you can say is your name, rank, serial number. But one thing you learned in that thing, you didn't want to get caught. And so I got in country in November of '66, and then was on a swift boat for a year.
So what river and what part of South Vietnam were you on this boat?
Okay, now, so the coast is 900 miles, and so I was actually assigned to Cam Ranh Bay, which is on the central coast, and the operation was called Market Time. That was the whole big picture. We had areas 4 and 5, which were about probably 200 miles. And we would have maybe a 15 or 20 mile area, like 4 Charlie, 4 Delta. 4. So you'd leave the base at 7 in the morning. It may take you 3 hours to get to your area. You'd be there 24 hours, then you'd come back, take you 3 hours. So you were out 30 to 35 hours. You'd be off a day, and then you go back out again. So my division was home based out of Cam Ranh Bay, which, if anybody knows the geography, we were really from Tuy Hoa to a place called Phan Thiet.
Now these boats, you can see that there are guns on the fore and aft, to use naval language, but you also sent me a photograph in which there is a mortar attached to one of these guns.
If I can look, and I don't know if you can pick this up, but the Swift boat, it's 50 feet long. It's about 14 feet in width. It's aluminum hull, so I mean the bullets would go right through the hull. It wasn't armored, and so the pilot house where the person would be driving, you could drive from here or drive back here. These are twin 50 caliber machine guns, which the bullets are about that long. And back here, this is a 50 caliber machine gun, but it's mounted on top of an 81 millimeter mortar. So most mortars, you think about, you got them pointed up and you drop a projectile in there and then it goes out. You could do that with these, or you could set it on a mode where you could trigger fire it. You could just point it at a trawler or something else. And then we did a lot of shooting over on what's on the land, and so you would know how far it was, and you knew what angle to put it on, and then you could add charges to it to make it go. So this was very handy because you could sight in with the 50 caliber, and you could put it on single shot. You know, you could put tracers
like
in
a sniper rifle.
Yeah. So the primary thing while we're looking at the boat is we were a little bit like policemen, because your main thing, you're looking to stop the big trawlers from coming in. But on the other hand, they're smuggling stuff along the coast. So it'd be like you're on patrol in a police car, and we had permission to stop anything that moved. And so here's a boat, and you learn right quick, you don't do that. That's how they call dogs. So you'd say lie day.
Yeah.
And you'd pull up alongside somebody and put the ropes over, and then we would check their ID cards. Everybody had to have an ID card. If they didn't, you'd take them in. But you know, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You don't know what you're going to come up on. So it'd be like stopping a car in some, not too great area in the middle of the night, and you're by yourself.
Like a cop.
Yeah. So you always were supposed to have your flak jackets on and your helmet. So we would stop 25 to 35 boats a day. Some were fishing boats, some were people boats, some were cargo boats.
And some of them were enemy.
Right, and so you didn't know, so we'd have a guy up here and a guy here, and then everybody had an M16. I had a 12-gauge shotgun and a 38 pistol. And I had a Vietnamese liaison. He was supposed to be an interpreter, but he didn't speak English. So my bad 2 weeks language school, I mean, I knew enough to say, where are you going and what are you doing? And then my guy knew how I was saying it, and he would translate. And so from time to time, we would take people in. Well, of course, if you called them and they took off running, or, you could shoot over their head, and they'd usually stop. But, there are times when you shot.
Right. And I would assume you never get over the anxiety when you come up on somebody in the middle of the night.
Well, it was, and most of the time, you didn't go to sleep at night, because that's when all the mischief happened. Right. During the daytime, you might sleep a little bit in the day, but never at night. And we had starlight scopes. We had, infrared scopes, right, where you could see, hopefully you're looking. And we
explain what a starlight scope is. For
starlight scope is a device. It's an infrared device, and you look through it, and the images are green, but you can see movement, and it picks up heat. And so, we were on some things where we would have a operation, and maybe we'd be assigned just to sit there and watch the beach and phone back if you saw any movement over there. And so we had those, but we also had radar, so you could tell how close you were, and you had a depth finder and so forth. And we had a M79 grenade launcher, which was a great weapon. It's 300 yards, but it's really accurate.
Yeah. Let me have a piece of paper, if you would, please. These are some notes that you wrote to me, and I read over them, and I left another copy in the other room. But I just want to ask you about some of the guys you served with by their nicknames. Okay, just give me a sketch of the guys. Who was Hillbilly?
Okay, I'll tell you. Let me tell you about, first of all, the crew. These weren't in my crew. These were guys like me. They were an officer in charge of a boat like I was. But the crew, we had a gunner's mate, we had a radioman, we had an engineman, we had two 12V71 diesel engines. We would go about 35 knots, which is 40 miles an hour. But and then we had different people had different roles, just like a football team. Everybody can't be the quarterback, but if the tackle doesn't do his job, so I would say this generally. Anybody that served in Vietnam, everybody had a role. Yeah. And some people got more headlines, if you will, but everybody's necessary. It's like the body. All right, so, but we worked when we were on patrol for the Coastal Surveillance Center, and we went round and round with them because some of them had never been on patrol. And the worst thing we had to fight a lot of times was the weather, because the waves would come all the way over your boat, break your windows out, and during the monsoon. But so we had a unofficial radio net. We didn't get permission. We just came up with it in our division. So we would switch to a field radio, just like you'd have out in the jungle. Yeah. And we'd say, come up on circuit so-and-so. So my call sign was, I think you pronounce it Nguyen, Nguyen. I called it Nguyen, which was the wrong pronunciation, but I had gotten serious about the language school, and I could speak it pretty good, and I would wear black pajamas sometimes, and so the guy named Hillbilly was a guy named Gail Griffith. He's from Palmersville, Tennessee, played basketball at Murray State. He's on the city council in Paris and the vice mayor. But he was a character, and he was 2 weeks behind me. And so he was an excellent guy. By the way, he's the one that got shot up the worst. He got shot in the stomach with an AK-47. One night he pulled up and shined the spotlight on a boat, and the guy had a gun and shot him in the stomach. And fortunately, there was a hospital ship about 7 miles away, saved his life. Yeah. But that's Hillbilly.
All right, let me ask you, who was a Big Red?
Big Red, you kind of look like Big Red, except he had more hair than you did. Yeah. Big Red was named Rusty Hodges. He was about 6'1", 270. He was a tackle at the University of North Carolina football team. And so that's what we called him. You didn't necessarily get your own name. And Big Red ran aground one time in hostile territory, and we had to go down there and pull him off and watch out for the bad guys that they weren't going to wade across and get him.
Yeah. Let's see, Silver Fox.
Silver Fox was an old guy. He's probably 35. He was a commander.
And you were what, about 23?
I was 20. I turned 25 in Vietnam. There's a guy there named Renegade. That's Burt Reniger from West Memphis, Arkansas. Wow. And Burt was the best banjo player I've ever heard. He introduced us to the song "Ode to Billy Joe" that came out while we were there. And but Burt stayed in. He retired as a captain. Yeah. And then there's one called New Kid. New Kid was a Naval Academy guy. About half of our guys were Naval Academy graduates. This would be a very good career-enhancing thing. You could say I was the commander of a swift boat as you move. And he became an admiral. He was a 3-star admiral. Fabulous guy. Most fearless guy I've ever seen.
Yeah. Why do you say he was fearless? Or what does fearless mean?
Fearless
in
means,
that context?
there were a lot of places. Now, we were on the coast, but there were a lot of bays and a lot of inlets. Not so much rivers per se. But there were a lot of tight spots, and he would steam full speed ahead in there. Yeah. This guy was, if you wanted something done, he would do it.
Yeah. That's a word that, in our society is often overused about baseball players or actors or whatever, saying, well, you're very courageous to do this. But courage is, in Vietnam, any combat situation is a different thing. What makes someone courageous?
I think people are trained for that. You can hear it all you want, but there's certain things you can train for. Here's how you defend yourself. Here's how you shoot. But until the shooting starts, how are you going to react? Unfortunately, at one point, we were going to turn the boats over to the Vietnamese, and some of them had combat fatigue. I mean, they were there when the French were there. And I remember one time the shooting started, and we looked for the Vietnamese engineman who was on our boat. Well, he was down here hiding in the engine room. He was afraid he was going to get shot. Now, he was an exception. But I think people doing their duty in the midst of fire, I mean, I've seen the Ken Burns thing. I mean, both. I'd like to talk about my brothers at some point, but they were both in combat. And I mean, up close and personal. I mean, we got shot at from time to time. We did a lot of shooting, and we had a lot of anxiety, but we wasn't like being out in the jungle. If somebody shot at us in the middle of the night, our first reaction, we'd turn out to sea and wake everybody up and get our gear on and then go back in. And we usually could outgun them.
You have sent a picture to us of yourself and a number of guys you were on the boat with on the boat. And the people you were talking about earlier were other boat commanders,
right,
who had nicknames. Tell me about the guys that you worked with in the crew.
Hey, blue-collar guys. These were all Navy enlisted men. We had a bosun mate chief. He reminded me of Popeye. I mean, the guy had been in the Navy. He'd driven boats. He was from Philadelphia. We had our engineman was an E5. He was from Wisconsin. Our gunner's mate actually was a torpedoman in real life, but he was from New York. Our radioman was from Wichita. He's a deputy sheriff out there now. And then our seaman, who became an engineman, was a Mexican-American from Tucson. So that was our crew. We went all the way through together, and I was with them first 8 months, and then when I became the acting commander of this division, then they split my crew up. But there's a picture of them. Maybe it'll be seen, and I know I'm standing there. I got a knife, and Ewing's Pirates. So Pirates. we were great, really good guys. But just like any kind of team, you watch each other's backs. And you counted on those guys to be able to do. You counted on that gunner's mate after every patrol to clean the 50s, because the salt water could get in there and mess them up. And I mean, it'd take 2 hours to clean those things or change the oil.
I want to talk about your brothers in a minute, but I want to kind of backtrack for a second. You referenced earlier about how everybody has a job, and you referenced football just now. Now, I know that your father was a very well-known and successful football coach, and you played on a really good football team in high school. You talked about several guys who played football. Talk about team sports and how you learn, how people learn to do these kinds of things.
Well, I think part of my training to get through a place like Vietnam or get through life is this whole team concept. The Bible says we have a body, but not everybody's an ear, not everybody's an eye, not everybody's an arm. Everybody's got a different function. And so like in high school football, we have running backs, but we have guards and tackles and ends and linebackers, and everybody's got a job. And so you count on everybody to do their job. And so if somebody doesn't, then you have to say, hey, you need to do this better. I had a guy that was ahead of me in Vietnam, was an officer in charge, a really fine guy, and he called me aside one day and he said, y'all need to spend more time cleaning those weapons when you get off patrol. And I know it's hard, but when you turn that boat over to the next crew, you got to have them in good shape. And I mean, it was good constructive criticism. And so I think this whole team concept, and then the other boats you're with, we would interact with the Army from time to time, a lot of interaction with the Air Force. Our base was at the end of a peninsula with a large Air Force base. We had interaction with the ROKs, which are the Republic of Korea troops. We had several operations with the SEALs. There was one part in our area, and I think I have a picture of it. When I returned there, this was one of the most frustrating things was when we got there, you couldn't shoot unless you got shot at. Or there were Americans under fire and you had an American spotter. Very frustrating, because there were places where you knew it was all enemy. Now, that changed while I was there. So when I left, there were free fire zones. I mean, there was a 10-mile-long peninsula that no friendlies had been in since the French. And ultimately, we'd shoot up in there all the time, just maybe to keep them awake at night. But I'll tell you an interesting aside. The Navy gunfire spotter for our area's call sign was Scrappy 26 Charlie. And so we always wanted to get a call from him because he could tell you where to shoot, and you had permission. So one day I'm going through Nha Trang, and they call up and say, can you pick up Scrappy 26 Charlie and give him a ride to Tuiwa? And I said, okay. Pick this guy up, tell my guys to get him some coffee. He, about 30 minutes later, comes up, and we start talking. He's the same rank as I am. And I said, man, where are you from? He said, Memphis. I said, Memphis? Where'd you go to high school? Central. No kidding. When did you graduate? 1960. Me too. And so I knew lots of people he knew. A guy named Charlie Thompson. And so Charlie said, well, let's go up here and shoot. And I said, man, I can't shoot unless I got an American spotter. He said, I'm an American spotter. So he's there on my boat. He said, right up in there is this VC supplier. Go ahead. And so he was on one part of the radio, and I was on the other. And, you know, we're shooting. He went on to be a TV producer. In 2020, wrote a book about the death of Elvis and passed away a couple of years ago. But
he's the guy who really broke the story of what caused Elvis's death.
Yeah, he and Jim Cole.
He and Jim Cole. That's right. Jim Cole, I run into at the gym all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
That's
Charlie.
how I met Charlie.
Yeah. Tell me about your brothers. Tell me their names. Tell me how much younger they are than you.
Bob and Joe. I had one brother, John, who's 2 years younger than me. And then Bob and Joe were twins. They got out of Whitehaven in 1963. Bob immediately enlisted in the Army, 3 years. Joe went in the Marines, but he was going to do the 6-month basic training at, Camp Lejeune and Camp Geiger and so forth. Then he'd be in the reserves for 4 or 5 years. So they actually went in while I was still in college. And then I graduated in the summer of '64. Bob went through basic training at Fort Polk, and then he went to Germany. He was in the Army in Germany for like 18 months. And then he got his orders to Vietnam. In the meantime, I'm on my ship. We're 5 months off Vietnam, 4 months San Francisco. In January of '66, Bob comes through San Francisco. He's getting ready to fly to Vietnam. And so we went out on the town in San Francisco. So he's in country. I'm off the coast. Then I get my orders to swift boats. And so I get to Vietnam November '66. Bob is leaving in January of '67. He was in a security platoon or company at Pleiku up in the Central Highlands, and also later was at a place called Ban Me Tut. And they would provide security for the bases, which would get attacked from time to time. Plus, he would also go on missions, helicopter missions, as a crewman on a helicopter, gunner. And so when I got there, of course, you got to remember, we didn't have internet then. We didn't have texting. We didn't have tweeting. We didn't have anything. We didn't have, people would write you snail mail stuff. You didn't call home. I don't even remember how we hooked up, but anyway, he flew down to Cameron on a helicopter, and we went to see the Bob Hope show Christmas of '66, which was fabulous. I mean, they were singing Silent Night. I mean, there's 20,000 troops there. It was really a morale builder.
Right.
But then he left.
But you're sitting there with your brother.
Sure, and there's a picture of me on the beach. We had this fabulous beach. I mean, it's white sand beach. It looked like Maywood. And, but he was down there. But he's an E4. He's an enlisted man. And I remember we were there playing cards that night, and some of the people said, well, let's go over to the Air Force Officers Club, which we do about once every 6 weeks. And I said, no, I'm going to stay here with my brother. Next thing I know, 2 of my buddies had put him in an officer's uniform. And so he said, man, they'll court-martial me. I said, nobody will know. You just tell them you're the youngest swift boat driver in the Navy. So we go over to the Air Force Officers Club, and Bob Hope's there, and Joey Heatherton, and Anita Bryant, and we had a big time. So But Bob came back, got out of the Army in January of '67, and you know, basically we went to school some. You know, I lived with him in a house when I got out, and I'll come back to Bob.
Yeah.
Joe was in the Marine Reserves. He was going to Mississippi State, and he drilled out on Jackson Avenue in a motor transport unit. And at some point, he missed some drills. I always have said he thought it was more important to see Auburn and Mississippi State play one weekend instead of drilling, and they ordered him up for 2 years. I don't know if that's accurate, but I do know they ordered him up for 2 years and kept his orders on the bulletin board for a long time, saying, here's what's going to happen to you if you don't come to drill. And so Joe was at Camp Pendleton. He was trained in an amphibious type vehicle called an Otter. It was a tracked vehicle, and sometimes it carried a few troops and supplies, but it had a .50 caliber machine gun on it. And so he's at Camp Pendleton. Well, I was coming up. I had about 6 months left in Vietnam, and I thought 6 months left in the Navy. And there was a rule that said if you request it, you can have requested only one part of a family be in country at the same time.
Yes. So
I wrote him a letter. This is like May of '67, saying, look, I know you're destined to come here. Where I am, it ain't safe, but it's a lot safer than being out in the jungle and in the mountains. And if it will keep you from coming, I'll extend for 6 months. And wrote a letter to that effect to the people. And it ended up, he wrote back and said, if you extend 6 months, I'll still have 8 or 9 months to go, and they'll send me anyway. So anyway, I didn't do that. And about that time, I got a letter back saying, we're extending you a year. LBJ froze all the regulars. So I had to do 5 years instead of 4. Well, Joe got to I Corps, which was heavy Marine, in I guess October of '67. Mm-hmm. And he was mainly at a place called inThe, which I think you were there, and was involved in combat up in that area.
And he was there for the Tet Offensive.
And he was there for Tet, and he did the 13 months. So, you know, so I actually was still in when both of them got out. Mm-hmm. You know, I was, you know, because I had to stay that extra year. So when I got out, I started the law school, and Bob and Joe and I and John, who was my brother, he was smarter than us. He got in a Army unit in Clarksdale, and then Air Force Guard unit out at the airport. So he never went to Vietnam itself, but we all had a house together, and we were all on the GI Bill, and I'm trying to pass law school, and they're trying to. I think John was in about his 8th year of undergraduate, and you know, so.
What does Vietnam mean to you now? I mean, you have a lot of memories. You remember people, you remember incidents, you remember nicknames, you remember stories. But what does Vietnam, if it's possible to say, what does having been to Vietnam mean to you now? And is it something that you are glad that you did?
Well, yeah, looking back, I'm glad I did it. You know, everybody's got a story. Everybody's got a life story. Okay, I can tell you my life story through age 18. I mean, I'm growing up in Whitehaven, which we were not even in Memphis. We were a suburb. Then I went to college. And then I went in the Navy for 5 years. And, you know, certainly the things I learned in the Navy I use later in life. But I'd say, and so I learned things on that 2 years off the coast. And there are a lot of people in Shelby County that they didn't go in country Vietnam, but they were on the Enterprise or the Constellation or the Ticonderoga, or I remember replenishing the ship that was putting the first Marines ashore at China Beach. But they all had a role, and but especially that 1 year in country, you know, where you're you're anxious about things, and you learn to cope, and you learn teamwork, and so I think that stood me in good stead. Now, we all, we can talk about this in a little bit, but I think everybody that went there is touched by it.
Yeah.
And I think, how do people cope with a traumatic event in their life, whether it's war or whether it's something else? How do they cope with grief? I mean, you can have trauma without grief, but how do you deal with that? And some people dealt with it better than others. And sometimes I think, well, I was able to suck it up and go on, but on the other hand, from time to time, I hate to use the term flashback, but if I hear some loud noise, I might hit the floor and say incoming.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's always with you.
But it's always with you, and I know, just like Bob and Joe, they were in much more dangerous places than I was. Bob, who passed away in 2015, Bob, came back, and he, somebody'd say, Bob, what are you doing? He said, well, I just got back from Vietnam. I think I'm going to go down and try out for the Red Sox. And so he'd go down to spring training every year. Joe was working in Florida, so Bob worked here at Patrick's, and everybody knew him as Bubba. And Bubba, was really a good guy, but you can tell it affected him. Yeah. He had a fiancée when he went over. And, at some point he didn't have a fiancée. And, part of that, I think, could be attributed to the war. I mean, I mentioned my classmate that got killed in combat. I mean, we had several friends who committed suicide that were Vietnam guys, and
right.
Somebody said, so-and-so, he never was right again. So, it's a difficult thing, and we never heard of the word PTSD. Right. Now, we probably all had it. Yeah. And yeah. Some of us still do to a certain extent, but it was an invaluable thing as far as, the people I was in the trenches with, they'll be lifelong friends. Just like your high school teammates or your shipmates or people you work with. I mean, there's that bond. Let's call it shared hardship. Right. And of course, I think about my mother and dad. I mean, we were back to back to back. I would think if my three children were back to back to back in Afghanistan, I'd be pretty anxious.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about the Ken Burns series. And one of the reasons that we decided to do this show is because the Ken Burns series was going to be aired on PBS. And the New York Times is writing about Vietnam 50 years after the fact. And other people are. But you saw the series. I'd just kind of like to get your thoughts about it. And I want to get your thoughts about how Vietnam veterans are seen by people who aren't veterans.
Well, obviously, I was 25 when I left Vietnam in late '67, so that's exactly 50 years ago. So I've had 50 years to reflect. I've lived 25, and then I lived 50. I'm 75. So I've read lots of books about Vietnam, and I've seen. I saw Apocalypse Now, and contrary to Apocalypse Now, I didn't water ski behind my boat. That was a PBR, which is a patrol boat river, which are smaller boats than this swift boat. But the series, I watched 95% of it, and you can watch it online now. So the first couple of episodes are really the history. And I knew most of the history, but it was good to see it kind of played out again, how Ho Chi Minh, was a nationalist but communist, but the whole French thing. And, I read a book, and I'm going to stick to your question, but many people saw the movie We Were Soldiers and Young, or read the book where Colonel Hal Moore took the 7th Cavalry into the Ia Drang Valley, lost 235 people. That's the first big battle of the war. We were off the coast when that happened. And I think that was a big wake-up call. And a fabulous book, him and Joe Galloway. Well, there's a sequel called We Are Soldiers Still. And many years later, they went back to Vietnam, met with General Gipp and the man who was the general on the scene at the big battle. And General Gipp took them out to Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh had defeated the French in 1954. Showed them what all they did. And then he turns to Hal Moore and says, didn't you Americans ever study history? Don't you understand that we're here and we're going to be here after y'all have gone? And ultimately, Moore and Galloway actually fly down to the battlefield and spend the night with these guys, the North Vietnamese guys. And I think Moore's conclusion in the book is something like, wrong place, wrong time, wrong war. So now, let me go back. I mean, I'm proud of my service. I'm proud of everybody that served in Vietnam. As I said at the outset of this program, we were men and women under authority. We grew up where if the president said go, you go. Our fathers had done that. They all didn't want to go to Normandy. They all didn't want to go to fly in the South China Sea and get killed. But they did their duty. And so I'm proud of everybody that did that. Now, obviously, the Burns series features a lot of that. It does have, and of course, I was aware of protest, although they were not as big when I was there as later. So when I got back,
but you were back in the States by the time they did get there.
So when I got back, you know, I think people thought highly of us, at least the people we interacted with. We didn't get spit on. Now, my friend Burt Renegade, he ended up staying in. He went from Vietnam. He was a NROTC instructor at Duke, and he was there. And they had been told if there are any protests, don't react. And he said he was walking across campus one day in his uniform. Jane Fonda was there and comes over and spits on him. And of course, this guy was kind of feisty, and he said it took every fiber of my being not to slug her. And I would say that would be true. So we didn't think much of the protest. Now, I understand. I mean, you know, people have a right to protest. My brother was reminding me yesterday, they got back from Vietnam, and they were in the airport, and there were a bunch of Hare Krishnas and hippies protesting. And the guy with him said, well, this is my brother, and there was an African-American guy who went to Jeter. And they flew back together, picked them up, took them both home. And he said, well, I guess this is who we're fighting for. You know, we're defending their right to do what they want to do. You know, this is America. So I think the Burns series, you know, and I think it was helpful to hear from the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese, you know, their view on what happened. I mean, I think this program and the dialogue, because a lot of times people, whatever trauma they've had, they stuff it or they drown it in alcohol or whatever. So we saw lots of casualties of people that served there, but served in World War II, served in Afghanistan, served in Iraq. I mean, you know, it's a hard thing to be in a conflict with other human beings.
Did you think the Burns series was balanced? Did you think it was fair?
I don't know. I mean, there are people that say, oh, they had well, I thought it was pretty good overall. I mean, I think they heard from people that were protesting. They heard from families who lost. I remember the guy, maybe he's in New York. This guy was, you know, got killed, and then they had the different ones. I do think one thing that, the two things that distressed me the most about it wasn't the protesters. It was LBJ and Nixon, you know, speaking publicly saying this, but then they've got the tapes of their internal meetings, and maybe the truth was something else. Mm-hmm. And of course, people don't like it when politicians don't tell the truth. And so there's a lot of doubt about when politicians speak. So the other thing that I think really came home to me and really wasn't a factor when I was in country was the whole body count thing. I think I saw on the burn saying it was something like, here's how you tell if you're succeeding. If we killed 3,000 VC last month and they can only resupply 1,000, then we're successful. Yeah,
or if we claim we killed 3,000.
So we lost 300 guys. And so you had incidents like My Lai. Ironically, I got out of the Navy. My third year in law school, I was on a thing called the National Moot Court Team. And you argue it regionally with other schools, and then the top two in each region go to New York City for the finals. And we got to go to the finals. And the problem was the Cali case. And, Cali's defense is basically, I'm following orders. But take the Burn series, this whole body count thing, well, you go into a village, well, who's good guy, who's bad guy? You can't tell. When we search boats, we can't tell what's in somebody's heart. We don't know who's good guy and bad guy. And most of them were good where we were.
Yeah.
And so, but then if you just shoot somebody, that's wrong.
Yeah. Let me ask you, this is a kind of a tough question. Again, with 50 years to think about it, did we belong in Vietnam in that war?
That's Monday morning quarterbacking.
Right.
I think my analysis is this. In 2010, I went back to Vietnam. My daughter and her husband were teaching school in Korea. And she called up and said, hey, last year we went on spring break to Indonesia. Some people in our school have been to Vietnam. We're thinking about going. Do y'all want to go? Well, yeah. So I got my wife and my son, and we flew to Seoul and got my daughter and son-in-law, and we flew to Saigon, now called Ho Chi Minh City. And I'll tell you a couple of things about that. But I compare Korea and Vietnam. After World War II, the big threat becomes communism. So when I'm in high school, the big threat is the communist, the Russians versus the U.S. and who are their allies. You got the Berlin Wall. And so the communist North Koreans invade the South. U.S. and other NATO allies come in on the side of South Korea, push them back. Then the quote, red Chinese, the communist Chinese, come down. And so you get this big war. But ultimately, they draw the ceasefire line at the 38th parallel. And so there was a thing called the domino theory, Eisenhower and others. So if we don't stop them here, then the dominoes will keep falling, and pretty soon the communists will dominate and not democracies. So here's an example, Korea, where we stop the dominoes from falling. Well, same thing in Vietnam. Vietnam, the French are defeated in 1954. They draw a line at 17 degrees north latitude. That's the same as the 38th parallel in Korea. And you got a north and south. North's communist, south's not. The 1954 agreement says within 2 or 3 years we'll have elections. Well, they didn't have elections. The South is allegedly, and they're allegedly an ally, but the U.S., Kennedy, etc., we're on their side because we don't want the communists to come in and take over. It was Korea deja vu all over again. Well, we drove the communists back in Korea. As far as I'm concerned, the strategy in Vietnam, we'll hold our ground here and we'll hold them back. We've been there, done that, and a different enemy. But I think the national leaders, I don't think they went in with bad intent. I mean, I think they're operating.
Our leaders.
Yeah, our leaders. I think they're operating on, you study history,
right.
What's happened before. And they're trying to figure this out, and hopefully you can just do it with advisors. Yeah. Well, now we need a little more than advisors. Maybe we need a few ground troops. And then, of course, by the end of the thing, we got 500,000 troops.
Yeah. What was it like going back?
Fascinating. I really enjoyed. I mean, I've talked to Vietnam vets who say, no way I'm going back. But I heard a guy on your show recently saying that's on my bucket list. Vietnam is a very beautiful country. Of course, I mainly was on the coast. I mean, white sand beaches. I mean, beautiful tropical climate. But so when I went through this tour agency, they said, "Do you want to go?" I said, "No, I want to go where I was." So we flew into Saigon. Fascinating. We got there the Saturday before Easter. We go to a church on Easter Sunday, Protestant church, and it's got Vietnamese writing on the door, and underneath it in English it says, "In God we trust."
Wow.
I mean, it's like, whoa, where are we? And we go in there, and so, we introduce ourselves, and so here we are, we're worshiping the same God together. And so at some point, the pastor, and I told him my son played the guitar, my son-in-law played the piano, so we did a couple of songs, and then he said, "Will you speak?" So, okay, so here I am in Saigon, and then we went to the War Remnants Museum. We flew from Saigon to Cam Bay, the same airport that I had flown on in '66, and stayed in a hotel in Nha Trang. It's better than Hawaii. The bad guy area, free fire zone, now the Koreans have built a shipyard there. We had lunch at a resort on an area where before we had firefights, and people were friendly.
It doesn't seem like I've talked to several people who have been, and it said it doesn't seem to be that resentment that a lot of us feel, a lot of Vietnam veterans feel.
I think the people were pretty friendly. I took a lot of pictures. I had my patrol books. I still have them. And I'd say, okay, I want to go to this place. I want to go to Damon. I want to go to Bung Ro Bay. I want to go to Kana. And so we would go there and look at that. And I will say this, of course, lots of people escaped. I don't know who all got killed when the communists took over. I know a lot of people ended up, if they weren't killed, they went to re-education camps. But we came out of the War Remnants Museum, and there was a book there called The Girl in the Picture, and there's a famous photo of a little girl running down a road with no clothes on, and there had been a napalm attack. And I think you said you met the photographer.
I met the guy who took the picture, yeah.
The girl's name is Kim Phuc.
Probably the most famous picture,
right.
or the second, perhaps.
Kim Phuc is the girl. And so when the communists took over, she becomes like a propaganda symbol. This is what the South Vietnamese puppets and the Americans did. She had burns all over her body. They ended up sending her to med school in Cuba. She met a guy. They got married in Moscow. They're on their way back to Cuba. Got off the plane in Canada and defected. Anyway, somebody had written a book called The Girl in the Picture. And I got back, read the book. She has a foundation for victims of war. I emailed and just said, "Hey, I just read your book, great book," so forth. That afternoon, I'm taking my nap, and I come downstairs, and my wife said, "Well, good talking to you," and hands me the phone. And a lady's on the phone, said, "Do you know who this is?" And I said, "No." She said, "This is the girl in the picture." And it was the girl in Canada. And a fabulous story and testimony. I mean, she said, "I was bitter. I couldn't forgive people." And ultimately, she became a follower of Jesus. And she said, "I knew I was forgiven, and I've now learned to forgive people. And I now have learned to love everybody, including my enemies, which is the hardest part." So, different people have dealt with trauma in different ways. I just went to a trauma healing thing. I went kind of to learn how to help people. But as my wife said, you probably need to go and hear it yourself. And one of the exercises was we went in and they said, think about some traumatic events in your life and go out by yourself and draw a picture of it. And I hadn't thought about this in years. And I drew a picture of this area where we have this thing, and we shoot, and there's bad guys, and you know, we hear maybe there were 8 killed in action enemy. We never saw any bodies. And I thought, well, that's, you know, we were all happy. But then I'm thinking, you know, those people had families. You know, those people had souls. And so in my picture, I'm drawing these 8 bodies laying there. And I got my boat off the coast, and we'd been shooting. And I mean, I really kind of, but I kind of dealt with it. I didn't realize it was still in there. And so a lot of people, you know, hadn't dealt with things. I want to say this about one of my brothers, Joe. You know, both of them were they both got their medical care primarily at VA. VA did a really good job on both of them. But my brother now, he's volunteered. He's done a lot of funerals with VFW. Now there's a program called No Veteran Dies Alone. It's like when VA has done everything they can, it's like hospice. And he's a volunteer for that. Maybe because some veteran's getting ready to die. They don't have any family. And so the premise is you're getting ready to die, you don't have anybody, they come alongside you. So I think this whole thing about taking care of each other and passing it on to the next generation is important.
It kind of goes back to the concept of team a little bit, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, I know you've worked with a lot of Vietnamese people. We only have 2 minutes left, but you work with Vietnamese people in your church. The older people who came over at the end of the war, how do they feel about
Well,
us?
of course, you know, they weren't. Most of the people, we have a Vietnamese congregation that meets at our church. I've heard there are like 8,000 Vietnamese in Memphis. The head of their congregation is a engineering professor at Union. But even though a lot of them, you know, some came as kids, he was 17, and so they speak pretty good English. But the older ones don't. Their heart language is Vietnamese. So if somebody speaks there, if I spoke there, you spoke there, they would translate into Vietnamese, even though 80% of them know the English. But delightful people.
And they appreciate, in a way, they appreciate America better than some Americans do, it seems to me, from having talked with a lot of them. But, well, listen, we've got to wrap it up now. I want to tell you how much I appreciate having you here. And anyone else who is a family member or a friend or an acquaintance who might want to appear on our show with us, there will be an email address on the screen. Email us and get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to talk with you about it. But again, thank you so much for being here, and your experiences were great. And the way that you recall them and the way that you put them in context, I think is going to be very strong for our audience. Thank you very much for being with us on Vietnam 360, and we will see you next time on the Library Channel.